The other phrase in this is naturalizing sense making. This is one of the 5 schools of sense making, and people like Weick and Klein are in the other groups. For me, sense making is defined as how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. How do we know enough? And I say there are 4 aspects of that which are critical. One is inattentional blindness. And a lot of you will know this. There's a famous experiment in which a group of radiologists were given a batch of x-rays and asked to look for anomalies. And on the final x-ray, a picture of a gorilla was placed in shared view, in clear view, and 83% of radiologists didn't actually see it, even though their eyes physically scanned the system. And the scary thing is the 17% who did see it came to believe they were wrong when they talked with the other 83%. So a large amount of what's called weak signal detection, and by the way, you can't train people not to do this. It's part of what it is to be human. And Klein has famously said that cognitive biases aren't biases, they're heuristics. They actually have evolutionary advantage. But weak signal detection means you've got to find the 17% before other people notice it. Now, the slide I've got here actually shows, sorry, I'm just trying to get up here. Yeah. So basically the slide here shows the result of an exercise where we've presented a situation to several thousand respondents who are culturally, cognitively, and experientially diverse. And they've all interpreted, that data. So this is where literally 1,000 people have interpreted the same data in real time. And as you can see, there are 3 dominant patterns of interpretation. And some of those, I mean, sometimes you see these and they have literally outlier clusters. And part of the capability we're starting to build for governments and companies is the ability to do a whole of workforce engagement to assess the situation. And this is called micro-situational awareness and micro-scenario planning. And one of the things we're going to announce at the end of this is 2 mass participation events. One on micro-scenario planning about the post-pandemic future, and the other is on attitude mapping around ethics on triage, which is a significant real-time problem. And I've got a slide in front of me from one NHS region in the UK, which has got a box on it which says send home to palliate. And that's medical jargon for withdraw support, send them home to die, because we've got to give the equipment to somebody else. And those decisions have been made all over the world at the moment. So we're going to present ethical dilemmas, get people to interpret those ethical dilemmas, and then from that, we'll be able to draw these patterns to show how attitudes are shifting, because you don't want depersonalization of medical. You don't want people to become immune to empathy, because then you get major differences. That was a rapid adaptation of a project I was working on in children's hospitals to identify different types of attitude or belief in end-of-life decision for children who have to be withdrawn from life support. So weak signal detection is not about trying to train people to be open to things they're not seeing. It's about recognizing we've evolved to see only what we expect to see. So you have to radically increase the diversity in the human scanning system so that you get novelty. And the other thing we're launching next week are a series of these narrative-based, and they're quantitative approaches to narrative for families so that children can act as journalists, families can capture bereavement stories and so on. And aside from having local utility, they actually provide evidence back to government of weak signals or changes in attitudes when people are going stir crazy. The other 2 big conceptual things which come out of that, and this is something I've been, Robert Polo is working on as well, it's the new Sprigger handbook, is a switch from forecasting to what's called anticipatory awareness and anticipatory triggers. So I can't actually predict, for example, a terrorist outrage, but I can actually tell you when the plausibility of outrage is higher, and I can focus your attention on an individual aspect of what's happening. And we do that with intelligence algorithms based on large training data sets. So for example, and I'll take a completely non-forecasting example, if I use social workers to continuously gather records in real time, I've got fragmented self-interpreted data from children who have been abused and children who haven't. That creates a training data set which can trigger an alert for a social worker which says stay in this home and ask more questions. And if you think about it, all children get these puzzles where they're shown a black and white drawing, say, of a park, and they're told there are 15 kitchen utensils hidden in the drawing, and because they're told there are kitchen utensils, they know to look. So a lot of our work is that sort of anticipatory trigger. And then we get into what I term sidecasting, which is neither forecasting nor backcasting. Sidecasting is casting around in the present to see what directions of travel are coherent. Because in a complex adaptive system, you can't determine outcome. But you can commence journeys, and it's critical to know which pathways actually have coherence. And again, we use those landscapes to map it. So as I say, what we're about to do is to launch these 2 mass events. And we'll put the website up shortly. In fact, I'll put it in the chat room in a minute. All right, but I might put it in now while I remember it. And the way we do this, and this is a result of one we did on global warming, so this is actually a formal report which came out of it, is people interpret onto a series of triangles, and the triangles are drawn from theory in the field. Now, the reason we use triangles is to create a cognitive load on the brain. Because, and I'll use a completely prosaic example, if you ever do an employee satisfaction survey, you get a question which says, does your manager consult you on a does your manager consult you on a regular basis, scale of 0 not at all, 10 all the time? Now that question contains a hypothesis, and because you've got a Likert scale, you know what answer they want. We take a different approach. We ask a non-hypothesis question. We say, if you actually had to, if your best friend wants to join the company, what story of your recent experience would you tell them? That's a non-hypothesis question. Then we ask them to interpret it onto 6 triangles, one of which says, in this story, the manager's behavior was altruistic, assertive, analytical. So 3 positive qualities. So 6 triangles, 18 data points. And because you don't know what the right answer is, your brain flicks. We've wired people up to see what happens here. You go from what's called autonomic processing to novelty receptive processing, or what the behavioral economists call, you move from thinking fast to thinking slow. So you go to different attitudes or beliefs. Now, this was from a mass capture around attitudes and change in attitudes to global warming run earlier on this year. And you start to see how the patterns sort of emerge from that. And the key thing here is I can click on any of those areas and I can read the micro scenario or the situational assessment which happened. That's called disintermediation. On the stuff we're doing with families, a government official can click on the picture and see the story told by the family without any mediating interpretation. So the whole point on this is, and this was developed as a complement to scenario planning, but it's not a forces and factors workshop write 5 narratives approach. It's a real-time mass participation approach, because you get very little chance to identify weak signals and reinforce or dampen them. So the key thing in a crisis is to build a sensor network. And 10 years ago and 8 years ago actively, we started experiments which were successful in Wales, Colombia, Pakistan, Libya, Sweden, and Singapore, to use children as ethnographers to their own communities on a monthly basis. And by gathering stories which are self-interpreted by the people they interviewed, we can actually map local patterns, the street stories which indicated attitudes and beliefs and tensions and so on. And I argued then, and never managed to get the funding, that we should actually put this worldwide. So the vision was to have every 16-year-old in every school in the world acting as a journalist into their community every month. And one of the reasons I gave for that is, if we ever get a major pandemic, we need a network of observers which is familiar with the process before the crisis hits, not afterwards. You build networks for ordinary purpose, you then exploit for extraordinary need. So as I say, we're going to give you all a chance to participate in one of these and see the results. And we'll be launching a series of these pulses over the next month, yeah, to actually measure and test attitudes. So I wanted to finish with my favorite quote from Lincoln. You know, I'm Welsh, I'm not American. But if you don't know it, 2/3 of the founding fathers of America were Welsh revolutionaries. We've always been natural in that way, right? And this is from his famous speech to Congress. You know, as the times are anew, we must think anew and act anew. And I think it's the balance of those which are important. It's not just acting, it's also thinking. And what we're starting to witness is complexity theory, which is not the same thing as systems thinking. It's been difficult to sell it up to date. We've had pioneers, earlier adopters adopt it. But the fact I'm now writing the handbook for the EU and the fact we're doing all these projects, kind of like when the situation becomes dramatically different, people genuinely understand uncertainty. And the essence of complexity theory is it's known as the science of uncertainty. It's the science of systems where you can't determine outcome and you have to deal with the evolutionary opportunities in the present. So as Lincoln said, think anew, act anew, or as Aristotle said, you need Sophia and Phronesis. You need practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom. And it's the coupling of the two which is actually key. Blind sides of forecasting and backcasting is that they're objective based. So foresight is you project forward from the present. And one of the origins of backcasting, I've forgotten the author, but I remember reading his paper and he said, forecasting is pessimistic. We need to stop that. And I must admit thinking, well, if forecasting is pessimistic, maybe we should try and do something about it rather than just create a new technique. But backcasting identifies an ideal future state and then goes backwards to identify if there are key blockages and sees how to remove them. And that's valuable. Sidecast, but the trouble is they're biased by this the point about the gorilla. People talk about what they can imagine, yeah, from their own experience. And even if, I mean, I've done stuff in Singapore with science fiction writers. And even if you come up with a crazy scenario, which turns out to be right 3 or 4 years later, it's still rejected at the time. So the whole point about sidecasting is to cast around in the present to see what are the traction points, what are the weak signals, what are the trigger points, which if you put a small amount of energy in will allow the system to evolve forward to a better place. So you stop and in complexity, you stop focusing on the future and you start focusing on the present. And that's what sidecasting was actually developed for, yeah.